At the company party, the millionaire CEO decided to humiliate the cleaning lady in front of the hired musicians. Pointing to the piano, he laughed, "Play just one note and I'll promote you." Haha. He didn't know it was all a secret test set up by his father. To everyone's shock, the woman sat down and played a classical piece with a perfection that embarrassed the professionals. Before she finished, the CEO's phone rang. It was his father. When he answered, his face turned pale as the voice on the other end said the words that sealed his fate, confirming he had just ruined his career. The Metropolitan Lyric Hall in Manhattan was his domain. That night, every inch of crimson velvet and every strand of gold tracing the walls and boxes seemed to bow to his presence. Preston Hayes III, at the peak of his 35 years, felt the power vibrating in the air, an electric current that emanated from him and swept through the room. The orchestra, hired for a king's ransom, played a symphony that seemed composed to celebrate his ascent. He was the new CEO. The crowned heir, and this gala was his consecration. The vast business empire of his father, a conglomerate that moved colossal market capitalization, was finally in his hands. He smiled, a gesture rehearsed for the cameras and the admiring gaze of the guests, the Wall Street elite and the titans of industry. In his mind, he was already calculating future profits, the dividends that would accrue from his first bold decisions. He planned to expand investments, perhaps even explore the volatile crypto market, something his father had always deemed far too risky. From a discreet, darkened box, Arthur Hayes Sr. watched, his eyes, still sharp despite his age, focused not on the brilliance of the hall, but on his son's posture. There was pride, yes, but it was stained by a persistent worry. The family fortune had not been built merely on business acumen, but on a profound understanding of human character. And it was Preston's character the old patriarch questioned. Minutes earlier, at the start of the evening, he had summoned his son for a private conversation. "Preston," he had said, his voice calm yet firm, "tonight is yours. But do not think the throne fully belongs to you yet. There is one final test." Preston, who already felt like he held the keys to the kingdom, raised an eyebrow. "A test, Dad. I thought I'd proven my worth." Arthur ignored the arrogance. "Duchety, I sent an observer to this gala, an anonymous person who will be evaluating you, not on your ability to manage assets or analyze blue-chip stocks, but on your character, on your capacity to see value where others do not. Only after that person's assessment is the final transfer signed." Preston almost laughed. An observer, probably some foreign investor, a New York hedge fund magnate or a London private equity baron, someone whose net worth was measured in billions of dollars. It would be easy to impress them. He knew how to speak the language of money, of ambition. He would work the room, display his confidence, his business vision, and the observer would be charmed. The idea that the test might be something more subtle, more profound, never even scratched the surface of his thoughts. Now, back in the main hall as the classical music filled the space, his eyes swept the crowd, looking for a face that stood out, someone who exuded power and influence. A man in an impeccable tuxedo talking to a senator, a woman with dazzling jewelry who clearly commanded an empire of her own. He smiled to himself. The challenge was stimulating. Suddenly, the symphony concluded, and the conductor announced a brief intermission. Applause echoed, and buzzing conversations resumed. It was then that Preston's eyes, scanning the wealthy and famous faces, were drawn by a discreet movement near the stage. A solitary figure, dressed in a simple, generic uniform, stood out completely from the surrounding luxury. She paused near the magnificent Steinway grand piano, and for an instant, Preston's world, with all its noise and glitter, seemed to silence, focused entirely on this woman. It was Ilara. Preston knew her name because it was discreetly embroidered on the pocket of her grey uniform. A middle-aged woman whose hands, he noted with lazy contempt, were not those of someone counting money, but someone who wiped it clean. There was a stillness about her, an aura of invisibility that most people working at events like this learned to cultivate. Yet, her attention was completely captive to the grand piano. It wasn't the curiosity of someone seeing an expensive object. It was a kind of communion, a silent dialogue. Her fingers seemed to itch to touch the keys, a yearning so evident it was almost palpable. To Preston, this was a joke, a custodian mooning over a Steinway grand. It was the kind of scene you'd see in a cheap, sentimental movie. He looked away for a moment, forcing himself to concentrate on his mission, finding his father's spy. He analyzed a group near the bar, a Swiss banker known for his multi-billion-dollar hedge funds, a real estate mogul, and a young Silicon Valley prodigy who made his fortune in a new cryptocurrency. Any of them could be the observer. They were men who understood the language of assets and liabilities, who knew the value of a good deal. He exchanged a few words with them, discussing market fluctuations and the promising yield of his company's new stocks. He felt confident, in control. They listened with respect. The respect commanded by his family's name and the immense wealth it represented. But even while talking about interest rates and cash flow, his mind kept returning to that woman near the stage. Her image, so out of place, was like distracting background noise. Why? He was irritated by his own distraction. She was nothing, an insignificant pawn on the grand chessboard of his life. An employee whose annual salary likely wouldn't cover the cost of the champagne served tonight. And yet, there was something in her posture, in the way she looked at the piano, that provoked him. It was a pure admiration, something he rarely saw in his world where everything was measured in dollars, euros, or, lately, in Bitcoin. People in his circle admired the price of things, not their essence. It was then that the idea, perverse and brilliant, blossomed in his mind. The intermission was becoming monotonous. People were chatting, but the energy of the event had waned. He needed a moment, a spotlight. What if he used the custodian? Her humiliation would be his entertainment. It would be a display of power, disguised as a joke, as condescending generosity. He imagined the scene. He, the magnanimous CEO, giving the poor woman a chance. The laughter, the applause, that would be a power play. The anonymous observer, whoever they were, would see a leader unafraid to interact with all levels of his operation. A man with humor and charisma. In his calculation, he would be demonstrating a modern, accessible facet of leadership. The cruelty inherent in the act didn't even register. In his view, the gain to his image far outweighed any emotional cost to the woman, who, in his opinion, probably didn't have complex feelings anyway. She was just part of the scenery. Yes, it was perfect. He would put on a small show, reaffirm his status as the center of this universe, and, as a bonus, impress his father's envoy. A slow, predatory smile formed on his lips. He moved away from the group of billionaires, his body buzzing with the anticipation of his little theater. All eyes would turn to him, and to her. His hand rose, not for a greeting, but to silence the hall. The murmur of conversations began to die down as people realized the night's host was about to speak. Silence spread like a wave, and Preston felt the power of everyone's attention focused on him. He cleared his throat, the smile still on his face, and his gaze fixed on Ilara, who remained oblivious, lost in her admiration of the piano. "Hey! You! The cleaning crew!" Preston's voice cut through the air like a whip, amplified by the sudden silence. Every head turned. First to him, the smiling host at the center of power, and then following his gaze to the humble figure near the stage. Ilara startled, as if awakened from a dream. The heat of hundreds of eyes fell upon her, a heavy, uncomfortable blanket. For a second, confusion dominated the atmosphere. No one understood what the newly appointed CEO wanted with the cleaning employee. But then, Preston's intention became clear in his condescending grin. "You like the piano? Then come on up." The invitation was not kind. It was a command, a challenge thrown from a social height down to an abyss. A murmur rippled through the audience. Some guests, those closest to Preston's circle, let out little laughs, eager to please. Others, however, exchanged uncomfortable glances. The scene was, at the very least, in poor taste. In the box, Arthur Hayes Sr.'s hand closed into a fist over the velvet railing. Every word from Preston was a stab at everything he had tried to teach his son. He hadn't built an empire, a fortune spanning continents and diversified into countless ventures, only for his heir to use it as a club to smash the weaker. The true capital of his family wasn't in the bank statements filled with millions or the stock yield, but in reputation, in respect. And Preston, in his blind arrogance, was burning that invaluable inheritance in a bonfire of vanity. The observer he had hired wasn't a stranger, but someone he knew and deeply respected, someone whose judgment he valued more than any market analyst. And now, that person was down there, the target of his own son's cruelty. The pain he felt was sharp, a mixture of paternal disappointment and shame. Ilara, for her part, felt her heart race, not from fear, but from a cold adrenaline. This was the moment. Arthur's plan was audacious, and now she understood why. She needed to feel firsthand the nature of the man who would soon command the destiny of thousands of employees. She took a deep breath, adopting the mask of the frightened woman everyone expected her to be. Her shoulders hunched slightly, her hands twisted in front of her body, and she took a hesitant step toward the stage, as if her legs were made of lead. "Must be the first time you've seen one up close, right?" Preston taunted, relishing the attention. The laughter in the hall grew, more confident now. "Tell you what, play one right note and I'll give you a promotion." Ha! The humiliation was now a public spectacle. People settled into their seats, some with guilty pleasure, others with silent pity. Preston felt like a master of ceremonies, the king in his court. He gestured toward the stage with a hand, a theatrical, cruel invitation. Ilara continued her slow walk, climbing the small steps. Each pace echoed in the tense silence that had settled. She didn't look at Preston or the crowd. Her eyes were fixed on the piano, the only point of calm amid the storm of judgment. She stopped beside the instrument, her presence small and fragile under the bright stage lights, the ebony and ivory giant waiting for her. Ilara sat on the leather bench, the cold surface a momentary shock against the simplicity of her uniform. The piano was a sleeping giant, its dark varnish reflecting the hall lights like a nocturnal lake. For an instant, the weight of the charade hit her. The humiliation, though staged, tasted bitter. She felt the stares of the crowd like pinpricks on her skin, judging her, reducing her to a caricature of herself. Preston, standing a few feet away, was the personification of arrogance. He watched her with a mocking smile, the predator satisfied with his cornered prey. In his mind, the spectacle was running perfectly. His father's observer, wherever they were, would surely be impressed by his audacity, his ability to command the stage, to be the center of the universe. He saw the trembling woman and imagined she was intimidated by so much luxury, by being in the presence of a wealth she could never conceive. Little did he know that the true assets present were not in a bank vault, but in the hands now resting, hesitantly, on the ivory. A fleeting memory, vivid as lightning, crossed Ilara's mind. She saw herself as a girl in a small, modest room, the hands of her first teacher, an elderly gentleman with kindness in his eyes, guiding her awkward fingers over the keys of an old, out-of-tune piano. "The music isn't in the keys, Ilara," he would say. "It's in your soul. The keys are just the door." That piano had been bought with her father's life savings. A man who never understood interest rates or financial applications, but who had made the greatest investment of his life in his daughter's talent. That memory anchored her, a beacon of purpose amid the sea of scorn. She wasn't just here because of a contract with Arthur Sr. She was here for her father, for her old teacher, for every person whose worth is measured by the uniform they wear and not by the fire they carry within. The tremor in her hands, previously an act, became real for an instant, but it wasn't fear. It was contained energy, the storm gathering before it broke. In the box, Arthur saw the tremor in her hands and understood its true nature. It wasn't the hesitation of an amateur, but the vibration of a master about to unleash her art. He knew that energy. He had seen it backstage at great concerts in Vienna, in Milan. It was the calm before perfection. His son, however, saw only weakness. And that blindness was his greatest failure as a father. He had given Preston everything: education, opportunities, a business empire to manage, but he had failed to give him vision, the capacity to see true wealth that cannot be quantified in gold or Bitcoin. He looked at Preston's exultant face and felt a profound emptiness. The empire would continue, the money would keep flowing, but the legacy of his family, the soul of his work, was about to shatter. Ilara raised her right hand, the silence in the hall so deep you could hear the rustle of a dress. Her index finger descended and touched a single key. The note, a G sharp, sounded crystal clear, perfect, echoing through the theater with pristine clarity. It was a solitary note, but it held a promise of everything that was to come. Preston let out a loud, mocking laugh, breaking the spell. "Incredible!" he scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He turned to the audience, as if sharing an inside joke with his peers. "She got one right. I think the promotion's secured." The laughter spread, a chorus of subservience. Satisfied with his moment, he turned back to Ilara with a dismissive gesture, his hand waving as if shooing away an animal. "Now go fetch your mop bucket." Preston's words, "Go fetch your mop bucket," hung in the air, weighted with a contempt so thick it was almost suffocating. It was the final punchline of his performance, the coup de grace in his little play of power and humiliation. The crowd, taking its cue, began to stir, conversations resurfacing in murmurs. The show was over. The custodian had been put in her place, but Ilara didn't move. She remained seated, her posture erect, the solitary note she had played still reverberating in her soul. The mockery, the laughter, the command for her to disappear, all of it seemed to recede, becoming a distant hum. She closed her eyes for a brief second, not in submission but in concentration. In her mind, there was no metropolitan lyric hall, no arrogant CEO, no audience of multimillionaires. There was only the music, the score, etched in her memory, unrolled behind her eyelids, the furious arpeggios, the thundering octaves, the delicate, painful melody of Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody. No, too. It was a piece that demanded not just technical virtuosity, but a soul on fire. She took a deep breath, a simple act that seemed to pull all the oxygen and all the attention from the hall to herself. The conversations wavered and died again. The heads that had turned away swung back to the stage, intrigued by her stillness, by her silent refusal to obey. Preston, who was already turning to receive the approving smiles of his guests, noticed the change in the atmosphere. A crease of irritation formed between his eyebrows. Why was she still there? The audacity of the woman was unbelievable. He opened his mouth to repeat his order, perhaps with more sharpness this time, to ensure his authority was not questioned. But before any sound could escape, Ilara's hands flew onto the keyboard. It wasn't a subtle beginning. It was an explosion. A torrent of notes, rapid and furious, erupted from the piano, so powerful and unexpected that it caused the entire hall to collectively catch its breath. The crystal glasses on the table seemed to vibrate. The sound wasn't just loud, it was complex, a sonic architecture built in a fraction of a second. Ilara's fingers danced over the keys with a precision and speed that defied logic. These were not the hands of a custodian, they were the hands of a force of nature. The main melody emerged, majestic and savage, filling every corner of the theater, engulfing the audience in a wave of sonic shock. The orchestra, whose musicians had begun to put away their instruments, froze, turning in unison. Their faces, previously indifferent, now bore a mixture of disbelief and reverent admiration. The conductor, an internationally renowned man, gaped, his eyes fixed on the woman's hands on the stage. He recognized the piece, of course, but he had never heard it played with such ferocity and passion. Preston was paralyzed. The idiotic smile was still frozen on his face, a grotesque mask of his former arrogance. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. This couldn't be happening. It was a nightmare, a hallucination. The woman he had tried to humiliate was, at that moment, dominating the instrument, the stage, and every single person in the room. The music she produced was overwhelming, 10 times more powerful, cleaner, and more technically perfect than the entire orchestra he had paid a fortune to hire. She wasn't just playing the piano, she was making the piano sing, cry, and roar. In her hands, the instrument was not just a collection of strings and hammers, it was a portal to a universe of pure emotion, and she was the sole guardian. Preston's world, built on the solid foundation of money and power, began to tremble under the force of that impossible melody. The music was a torrent, a river of emotion that flooded the hall and dragged everyone into its current. Ilara was no longer in the Metropolitan Lyric Hall. She was in a place where only music existed. Her fingers, which moments before feigned nervousness, were now extensions of her will, moving with an intimacy and knowledge that only decades of dedication could forge. She navigated the most difficult passages of Liszt with unnerving ease, her wrists flexible, her arms moving in a ballet of strength and grace. The audience was in a trance. The initial skepticism had dissolved, replaced by an astonishment bordering on the sacred. Executives who spent their days analyzing the ups and downs of the stock market, whose minds were cold calculators of profit and dividends, were now completely vulnerable, their faces displaying a raw emotion they rarely allowed to surface. High society women, adorned with jewelry worth an entire estate, forgot their posture and leaned forward as if to absorb every note. In the box, Arthur felt tears stream down his face without shame. This was the true wealth, not the assets he had accumulated, not the holdings in his accounts, but the beauty a human soul was capable of creating. Ilara's performance was a rebuke to everything his son represented. Preston saw the world as a spreadsheet, people as numbers, value as something to be extracted. Ilara, with her music, showed a different universe, where value was intrinsic, where passion was the strongest currency, and where talent didn't wear price tags. He looked at Preston's exultant face, pale and sweating under the stage lights, and knew that the lesson, though brutal, was necessary. The empire he built needed a leader with a soul, not a tyrant with a calculator. He hoped, with a sharp pang of pain, that perhaps, just perhaps, this experience could crack Preston's shell of arrogance and reveal something of value underneath. Meanwhile, a subtle flashback touched Ilara's mind, blending with the music. She remembered a night years ago at Carnegie Hall, the packed theater, the expectant silence, the same dazzling lights. That night, she was the star, her name in gold letters on the program. She wore a designer gown, and the audience had given her a 10-minute standing ovation. The next day's critic would call her a living treasure, a force of nature. And now, here she was, in a custodian's uniform, playing with the same passion, perhaps even more, because this time the music wasn't just a performance, it was a weapon, a declaration. It was proof that talent, the true essence of a person, could not be contained by a uniform, a social status, or the ignorance of others. She channeled all the frustration, all the silent indignation she had felt at being judged by her appearance, and transformed it into music. The pain became a moving melody. The anger became a thundering crescendo. The piece approached its climax. The speed and intensity increased. Ilara's hands were blurs across the keyboard. The piano seemed to groan and roar under her dominion. The final notes were a series of powerful chords, hammered with surgical precision, each one resounding like a sentence. And then the end, a final note, suspended in the air, glittering like a solitary star before slowly extinguishing. And then silence. An absolute silence, deeper and heavier than any silence that hall had ever known. No one dared to breathe, no one dared to move. It was a silence of reverence, of shock, of a reality that had been turned upside down. Preston's smile had vanished completely, replaced by a mask of pure, abject terror. Sweat now ran freely down his face, staining the collar of his designer shirt, and in that deafening silence, a solitary electronic sound ripped through the air, shrill and profane. It was a phone ringing. Preston's phone. The sound of the phone was a profanation. In that sacred silence, created by Ilara's final note, the electronic ring sounded like a fire alarm in a cathedral. All eyes, which had been fixed on the pianist, snapped abruptly to Preston. He fumbled to grab the device from the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket, his hands trembling so violently he nearly dropped it. The screen's glare illuminated his pale, sweating face, and the name glowing there was visible to anyone close enough. Dad. That name, which had always been for him a source of power, of inheritance, of a guaranteed future, now seemed like the name of an executioner. A cold knot formed in Preston's stomach. His father was here, watching. He instinctively looked up, searching the darkness of the boxes, and could discern the silhouette of a man standing, motionless, observing him. The weight of that gaze was crushing. The crowd remained in captive silence, the musical performance forgotten for a moment in favor of this new drama, more intimate and infinitely crueler. The humiliation Preston had tried to inflict on Ilara was now ricocheting back at him, multiplied 1,000-fold. The phone continued to ring, each chime a nail in his coffin. He knew he couldn't ignore it. Answering was an admission of guilt. But not answering would be an act of insubordination he dared not commit. With a trembling finger, he slid to answer the call, lifting the device to his ear. His hand was so unsteady the phone clattered against his face. "Dad, did you see that?" he stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper, almost inaudible. He expected a reprimand, an explosion of rage. But what came through the line was something far worse. His father's voice, cold as steel, was not confined to the tiny phone speaker. From the box, Arthur Sr. spoke, and his voice, though not shouted, was projected with the clarity and authority of a man accustomed to commanding empires. It cut across the hall, sharp and unforgiving, so that not only Preston, but all the nearest guests could hear every cutting syllable. "I saw, Preston, I saw you humiliating the consultant I hired for your final test." The word consultant dropped like a bomb. A murmur of shock swept through the audience. The custodian, the woman he had treated like dirt, was the observer. The test, the revelation was so devastating, so complete in its irony, that Preston felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. The world tilted on its axis. His mind, previously so sharp at calculating profits and predicting market trends, was now a blank screen of pure panic. He looked at Ilara, who was now rising from the piano with calm dignity, and saw not a custodian but a judge. Her eyes held no triumph, not even anger, just a kind of sad clarity which made everything even worse. His father's voice continued, inexorable, each word a hammer blow to his career and his ego. You are arrogant, cruel, and cannot recognize true talent even when it's cleaning your floor. The accusation was public, the sentence delivered before the very elite he had tried to impress. The blood drained from his face, leaving him the color of wax. He was the spectacle now. He was the joke. The humiliation he had so carefully planned had transformed into a monster that was now devouring him alive. He wanted to scream, to protest, to say it was a misunderstanding, but his throat closed. He looked at the faces in the crowd and saw not admiration, but a mixture of pity, contempt, and a certain dark pleasure people feel in witnessing the fall of the mighty. His life, his career, everything he knew and valued was disintegrating in real time. Under the bright lights of the Metropolitan Lyric Hall, the silence that followed Arthur Sr.'s declaration was different from before. It was not a silence of reverence, but of judgment. Every guest in that hall was now a juror in the improvised court of Preston's life. He remained frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear, listening to the empty sound of the line his father had already disconnected. The patriarch's voice, however, echoed in his mind, repeating the words arrogant, cruel. These words were mirrors, reflecting an image of himself he had never wanted or never allowed himself to see. He had always seen himself as strong, decisive, a natural-born leader molded to command the family's vast business empire. He believed toughness was a necessity, arrogance an inevitable byproduct of success. He had confused the power he inherited with the merit he earned, now under the weight of hundreds of people's gazes, and worse, under the weight of truth. That self-image shattered. Ilara, standing beside the piano, watched Preston's deconstruction. There was no satisfaction in her expression, only a profound melancholy. She had accepted Arthur Sr.'s job not for money. Her career as a concert pianist had guaranteed her considerable wealth and solid assets and financial holdings, but because she believed in the principle behind the test. She understood that a leader's character impacted the lives of thousands of people. She had seen firsthand, in her many travels around the world, how a company's culture, shaped from the top, could create work environments that nurtured or destroyed the human spirit. What she felt now, seeing the desperation on Preston's face, was not victory, but wasted potential. He had the intelligence, the resources, all the tools to be a great leader, but he lacked the foundation, empathy. He lacked the capacity to see the human being behind the uniform. Preston slowly lowered his arm, the phone seeming to weigh a ton. His eyes swept the crowd, searching for a single look of sympathy, a sign that this could be fixed, but he found none. The faces that previously smiled at him with admiration and subservience were now closed off, some with calculated coldness, others with evident embarrassment. He was, at that moment, a toxic asset, an investment that had gone terribly wrong. The same people who previously vied for a moment of his attention now subtly distanced themselves, as if his failure were contagious. The business world was unforgiving of failure, especially one so public and humiliating. He could almost hear the gears in their minds working, recalculating alliances, rethinking partnerships. His reputational capital, built over years, had been reduced to zero in a matter of minutes. His desperate gaze met Ilara's. For an instant, he wanted her to say something, to defend him, perhaps to say it was all a joke, a test taken too far, but she remained silent. Her dignity an insurmountable barrier. Her silence was more damning than any accusation. It was then that his father's voice sounded again, this time only on the phone, which he still held uselessly. Preston flinched, realizing the call hadn't been ended. He brought it back to his ear, and Arthur's voice, now lower, more intimate, but no less devastating, continued the sentence. "The promotion you offered her," the old man said, and Preston felt a thread of absurd hope. Could he reverse it? An apology, a second chance? But the hope was annihilated by the next phrase, which sealed his fate with a terrible finality: "is yours." The phrase hung for a second, devoid of context. Absurd. Preston's mind, numb with shock, struggled to process the meaning. The promotion, his. How so? For a delusional instant, he thought his father was giving him an out, a bizarre twist that would somehow save him. But the illusion vanished as quickly as it formed. Arthur's voice continued, relentless and precise, like a surgeon excising a tumor. You're promoted to unemployed. Clean out your desk tomorrow. You failed. There was no anger in the voice, just the weight of a final, irrevocable decision. The word failed wasn't a shout. It was an epitaph. The call ended with a soft click, a tiny sound that signified the end of his world. The empire he considered his inheritance, the future he had planned with such certainty, all faded in that click. He was no longer the heir, he was an exile. The ringing in his ears became a roar. The hall, the people, the lights, everything began to spin, blurring into indistinct colors and sounds. He felt a wave of nausea. The air, once heavy with the scent of success, now seemed thin, impossible to breathe. He looked at his hands, the hands that should sign multi-million-dollar contracts, that should guide the future of a conglomerate, and saw them as useless, impotent. The irony of the situation was overwhelming. He, who lived in a world where net worth defined a man's value, had just had his own worth reduced to nothing, not by a stock market crash or a bad investment, but by a failure of character. His family's fortune would continue to exist. Dividends would continue to be paid, but he would be on the outside, looking in. Ilara watched the color completely drain from Preston's face. She saw a man who had not only been fired, but annihilated. The blow was not financial, it was existential. Everything that defined his identity had been stripped away in an instant, and surprisingly, what she felt was not schadenfreude. What she felt was a pang of compassion. She knew the pressure of legacy, the shadow of gigantic expectations. Her own talent, though a blessing, had sometimes been a burden, the demand for perfection a constant companion. She didn't excuse Preston's cruelty, but, for the first time, she saw beyond the arrogant CEO. She saw a boy who had spent his entire life trying to fill his giant father's shoes, and who, in the process, had forgotten how to tie his own laces. She took a step forward, an almost imperceptible movement, as if to say something. But what do you say to a man whose universe has just imploded? Meanwhile, the audience began to recover from the shock. The drama was over, and the social instinct of self-preservation took over. People began to avert their gaze from Preston, resuming their conversations in hushed tones. It was the polite way to ostracize him, to cut ties before the dust of his collapse could stain their reputations. The isolation around him became a physical force, an invisible wall separating him from the rest of humanity. He was alone, naked under the stage lights he himself had chosen. He tried to take a step, but his legs felt like sand. His gaze returned once more to the darkened box, but his father's silhouette was no longer there. He had abandoned him, leaving him to face the consequences of his own ruin. The night that should have been his coronation had become his public execution, and the only witness to his agony was the woman he had tried to destroy. Time seemed to stretch and contort. For Preston, every second was prolonged agony, lived under the microscope of the silent judgment of hundreds of people. He needed to get out of there, to escape that stage that had become his scaffold. With monumental effort, he forced his legs to move. His steps were stiff, uncoordinated, like those of an automaton. He didn't look at the audience, didn't dare to meet anyone's eyes. His focus was fixed on a single point, the side exit, a portal to darkness and anonymity. As he passed Ilara, he hesitated for a fraction of a second. Their eyes met, and in hers, he did not find the contempt he expected. There was a complexity there, a mix of sadness and perhaps disconcertingly understanding. She was not his executioner. She had merely been the mirror his father used to force him to see his own reflection. The responsibility for that catastrophe was entirely his. While Preston made his walk of disgrace, Arthur Sr. was already in his car, the phone in his hand. He took no pleasure in what he had just done. The pain in his chest was real, the pain of a father who had needed to amputate a part of himself to save the whole. He had spent years preparing Preston to take his place, teaching him about the stock market, international investments, the complex dance of global business. He had taught him how to build wealth, but failed to teach him about value. The test that night had been a final, desperate effort. He had given Preston a golden opportunity, not to impress an investor, but to demonstrate wisdom, to show that he could see beyond appearances, that he understood that his company's greatest assets were not the buildings or the shares, but the people. And Preston had failed spectacularly. The decision to fire him, though painful, was a necessity. The empire he built was more than a money-making machine. It was an ecosystem, a responsibility to thousands of employees and their families. Handing it over to a cruel and blind leader would be a betrayal of everything he had built. Back in the hall, the atmosphere had completely changed. The orchestra tried to resume its music, but the sound felt hollow, inadequate. The party was over. The guests began to disperse, speaking in low tones, anxious to discuss the night's scandal away from curious ears. Ilara remained on the stage, the piano beside her like a silent accomplice. The orchestra conductor approached her, his face still marked by admiration. "Maestra," he said, his voice full of respect, using the title she deserved. "It was an honor. We didn't know." Ilara offered him a small, weary smile. "Thank you. Sometimes the best performances happen when there isn't a program." Her mind, however, wasn't on the triumph of her music, but on the man who had just left the stage. She recalled a moment years ago when a young music critic, trying to make a name for himself, had written a devastating review of one of her concerts. She remembered the humiliation, the anger, the feeling of injustice. What Preston felt now was that multiplied by 1,000,000. The difference was that the criticism she received had been unfair. Preston's was not. His journey. The true journey was just beginning. The fall was the easy part. The challenge would be what he did now, at the bottom of the abyss, without the name, the power, and the money that had always defined him. Preston didn't remember how he reached the parking garage. The walk from the stage to the exit was a blur of averted faces and whispers that sounded like screams in his hypersensitive mind. He got into his luxury car. The scent of new leather and polish that once gave him a sense of power now suffocating him. He gripped the steering wheel with both hands, his knuckles white, his forehead pressed against the cold material. His body trembled uncontrollably. The reality of the situation hit him in waves, each one stronger and more debilitating than the last. Unemployed. The word was absurd. He had never been unemployed in his life. Since college, a golden path had been paved for him, leading directly to the top of his father's empire. He had never had to compete, to fight, to prove his worth on a level playing field. His identity was so intertwined with his title, with the fortune he represented, that without them, he didn't know who he was. He started the car and drove aimlessly through the streets of Manhattan. The city lights, which had always seemed a symbol of his own brilliance and success, now seemed to mock him, illuminating his failure. He thought of his friends, his business contacts. The calls would cease. The invitations to exclusive dinners and events would disappear. He was no longer Preston, the future billionaire, the heir. Now, he was just Preston, the man who had been publicly humiliated and disinherited by his own father. The social capital he had accumulated, which in his world was as important as financial capital, had evaporated. He was alone. The depth of this isolation was terrifying. He had always had a safety net, his family's vast wealth, a cushion that protected him from any real consequence. Now, for the first time, he was falling without a net. Meanwhile, in a luxury hotel suite, Ilara finally removed the grey uniform. It was as if she was shedding a character. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back was neither a custodian nor the world-famous pianist. She was just Ilara, a woman who had just participated in a complex and painful human drama. She felt a weight in her heart. The lesson Arthur Sr. had wanted to teach his son was brutal, perhaps necessary, but brutal. She wondered if there was another way. She thought about the music, how it could communicate what words could not. Her performance wasn't just a demonstration of skill, it was a plea, an attempt to reach the humanity behind Preston's arrogant facade. For a moment, when the music silenced him, she thought she had reached him, but the damage was already done. His arrogance had already sealed his fate. She sighed, feeling like a reluctant accomplice to a family tragedy. Her role in Arthur Sr.'s plan was over, but the story of that night, she knew, would continue to echo in the lives of all involved for a long time. She walked to the window and looked out at the city. Somewhere down there, a man was facing the longest night of his life, stripped of everything except the truth about himself. The question was, what would he do with that truth? The following hours were a void for Preston. He drove until dawn, the streets of Manhattan emptying and then filling again with the rhythm of a new day, a day that held no promise for him. He ended up in front of the building that housed the headquarters of his father's companies. His building, or, at least, what should have been. He stayed there, in the car, watching the employees arrive for work, people he knew, whose names he was aware of, but whose lives he had never bothered to consider. They were cogs in the machine he would inherit. Now he was less than them. They had a purpose, a place. He had nothing. The humiliation of the previous night had transformed into a cold, heavy despair. What his father said was true. He was arrogant. He was cruel. He had failed to recognize the talent right in front of him because he was blinded by prejudice, by his own sense of superiority. It was at this moment, the lowest point of his life, that the memory of Ilara's music returned to him, not as a reminder of his humiliation, but as something pure, something undeniable. He remembered how the music made him feel before the panic took over. For a few minutes, he wasn't the CEO. He wasn't the heir. He was just a man, hearing something of overwhelming beauty. The music had disarmed him, stripped him of his defenses. It had spoken to a part of him he had kept locked away for years, a part that didn't care about shares, profits, or the price of gold. It was the part that, as a child, was awestruck by a painting, or felt a lump in his throat hearing a sad story. It was his humanity, and he had silenced it for so long in his pursuit of power that he had almost forgotten it existed. Ilara's performance wasn't just a test, it was a gift, a painful gift, wrapped in humiliation, but a gift nonetheless. She had shown him what true value was. With a clarity born of desperation, he knew what he had to do. It wasn't about getting his job, his inheritance, or his status back. That was lost. It was about recovering himself. He picked up the phone, his hands still trembling, but with a new purpose. He didn't call his father. He didn't call any of his influential contacts. He searched the name Ilara Vance, concert pianist. The results were immediate and stunning. Concert reviews, recordings, interviews. The woman he had ordered to fetch her mop bucket was a legend. The magnitude of his ignorance hit him like a punch. He found her agent's contact and, with his heart in his mouth, wrote a message. Not a rehearsed apology, not an attempt to justify his actions. Just a few direct, honest sentences. I know I don't deserve it, but I need to speak with you. Not to ask for my job back, but to understand what I failed to see. Please. While he waited, each minute feeling like an hour, he made another decision. He went back to the office. Not to clean out his desk as his father had ordered, but to do something he had never done before. He went to the floor where the cleaning, maintenance and security staff worked. He found the supervisor, an older man named Mr. Carlos, who looked at him with a mixture of fear and surprise. And for the first time in his life, Preston apologized. He apologized not just for what he had done the night before, but for years of indifference, for never having truly seen the people who kept his world running. It was a start, a small, painful step out of the abyss. He didn't know if he would be forgiven, but he knew he had to try. The moment of greatest tension wasn't the fall, but the terrifyingly uncertain first attempt to get up. Ilara's response arrived late that afternoon. It was short and direct. The address of a small coffee shop in a modest neighborhood, far from the financial centers where Preston usually circulated, and a time for the next day. There were no words of comfort or recrimination, just an invitation. For Preston, that was more than he expected. The night was long, the first of many where sleep didn't come easily. He didn't sleep in his luxurious apartment, which suddenly felt cold and empty. Instead, he stayed in a simple hotel, feeling that he needed to strip away all the symbols of his old life to face the new one. The next day, he arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, wearing simple clothes, without the expensive watch or designer shoes. He sat at a table in the corner, his hands sweating, his heart pounding. He didn't know what to say, how to start. How do you beg forgiveness for such a fundamental failure of character? Ilara arrived exactly on time. She wore neither a custodian's uniform nor a gala dress. She was dressed in jeans and a simple blouse, looking like an ordinary woman, which made her even more extraordinary. She sat down across from him, her eyes calm and scrutinizing. The silence stretched for a moment, and it was Preston who broke it. He began, his voice failing. I have no excuses. What I did was unforgivable. I was blind, arrogant, and cruel. My father's words, he was right. The words came out with difficulty, but they were genuine. It was the first time in his adult life he had admitted a mistake without any reservation. Ilara listened in silence, her expression unchanged. Why did you want to see me, Preston? She asked, her voice soft. To apologize and to thank you, he said, surprising himself. Thank me, she repeated, one eyebrow slightly raised. Your music, that night after the shock wore off, it was the only thing that made sense. It showed me that there is an entire world of value that I never saw because I was too busy counting my money. He spoke for nearly an hour. He talked about the pressure of being Arthur Sr.'s son, about his insecurity masked by arrogance, about the emptiness he felt even being at the top of the world. He wasn't trying to win sympathy, he was simply exposing the truth, perhaps more for himself than for her. Ilara listened with a patience he didn't deserve. When he finished, she finally spoke. Talent, Preston, is like gold. It can be buried under a lot of dirt, but it is still gold. Everyone has value. Your mistake wasn't failing to recognize me. It was assuming I had none. She paused. Your father didn't do that to destroy you. He did it to save you. He destroyed the CEO so the man could have a chance to live. Her words hit him with the force of a revelation. He had been so focused on his loss, the company, the status, the inheritance, that he hadn't realized that perhaps he had gained something much more important, a chance to start over, to build an identity based not on his net worth, but on his character. Meanwhile, in his office, Arthur Sr. received a report from his head of security. The report detailed Preston's visit to the maintenance staff floor and his conversation with Mr. Carlos, followed by a formal apology to the entire team. For the first time since the gala night, a small smile touched the old patriarch's lips. Perhaps the lesson, however harsh, was beginning to take effect. He knew Preston's path would be long and difficult. Trust, once broken, takes years to rebuild. The empire he built still lacked an heir, but for the first time, he felt a spark of hope that the man his son could become would one day be worthy of leading it. The resolution would not be quick or easy, but the seed of change had been planted in the most barren and unlikely soil, the heart of a man who had lost everything. 1 year passed, a year in which Preston learned the true meaning of value. He didn't return to the company. His father, true to his word, had let him follow his own path. With a small part of his mother's inheritance, a trust fund his father couldn't touch, he started over. Not in the world of big business, stock market speculation or cryptocurrencies, but in something infinitely smaller and, for him, surprisingly more gratifying. He opened a small music school in a working-class neighborhood, using the capital to buy second-hand instruments and renovate an old warehouse. The goal wasn't profit, but to offer an opportunity to children who, like Ilara once, had talent buried under layers of social difficulty. He learned the names of every student, listened to their stories, and found a richness in those smiles that no stock yield had ever given him. His life was no longer about accumulating a fortune in dollars. It was about building a legacy of small joys. He had traded the pursuit of wealth for the discovery of purpose. That night, the Metropolitan Lyric Hall once again welcomed the pianist Ilara Vance. This time, her name was on the posters, and the event was in her honor. Preston was in the audience, but not in a velvet box. He had bought his ticket, one of the last available, in the upper balcony, the farthest and highest point of the theater, the nosebleeds. He had come alone, not to be seen, but to see, to listen. When Ilara walked onto the stage, receiving a standing ovation, and sat at the piano, the same piano from a year ago, Preston's heart tightened. The music began, and this time he truly listened. Each note was a color, an emotion, a story. He didn't think about business, power, or humiliation. He thought about beauty, dedication, the soul of a woman who transformed suffering and joy into sound. He understood that Ilara's art and the work he now did in his small school were, in essence, the same thing, an act of giving, of creating value where there was none before. It was the kind of investment that paid dividends, not in cash, but in dignity and hope. When the concert ended and the applause echoed, Preston remained seated for a moment, absorbing the experience. He stood up to leave with the crowd, feeling a peace he hadn't known in years. As he descended the stairs, a hand touched his shoulder. He turned and saw his father. Arthur Sr. was not in the rigid posture of a billionaire, but with the tired gaze of a father. They stood in silence for an instant, the noise of the crowd around them. "You heard the music this time, didn't you?" Arthur asked, his voice low. "Yes, Dad, I heard it," Preston replied, his voice firm, without traces of the old arrogance. His father nodded slowly, a gleam of something like pride in his eyes. "A foundation has to be solid before you can build a skyscraper. You're learning how to build." It wasn't forgiveness, nor an offer to return. It was something more important, recognition. A recognition that the son he had lost that night was finally becoming the man he had always hoped he would be. Preston smiled, a genuine, light smile. He nodded goodbye to his father and continued on his way, mingling with the crowd. He was no longer at the top, but for the first time in his life, he knew exactly where he was going.